Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm really pleased to be here today with Senator Wong, following our first in-person bilateral meeting. And I'm sure this will be the first of many meetings, and I look forward for us working closely together. Thank you for travelling to Aotearoa, New Zealand for consultations. I know you've had a busy travel program. I hope you'll agree that we had a productive and full meeting, and in fact, there's so much that we can work together on. I appreciated hearing from you about your ambitions for Australian foreign policy, and there can be no doubt that you've hit the ground running. In an increasingly uncertain and risky geostrategic environment, it's really important that we communicate and coordinate across the foreign policy spectrum. As we've set out in our joint statement, having a neighbour who is also a close friend is more essential than ever for the security and well-being of the citizens of both nations. During our consultations, we discussed cooperation and engagement in the Pacific region, in particular the importance of working together to support Pacific partners facing a complex and growing array of challenges, including the impacts of climate change and an increasingly contested strategic environment. Our common goals on the international stage, including our support for the international rules-based order and its institutions. Climate change and the responsibility on countries to commit to ambitious climate change action. Our responses to Russia's unprovoked and egregious invasion of Ukraine. And in an area close to my heart, I welcomed our discussion on placing Indigenous voices at the heart of foreign policy. I look forward to further discussions on this and many more issues that are important, sharing our experience, and as we develop and implement an Indigenous foreign policy outlook, I know that we have much to do together. I hope that your journey with regards to responding and implementing the Uluru Statement of the Heart is one that we can share and support. Further details on the breadth of issues Minister Wong and I discussed are set out in our joint statement. Can I invite you now, Minister, to have a call?
Thank you very much. Can I thank Foreign Minister Mahuta for hosting me and my delegation here today. It's been a really wonderful opportunity, and you did us a great honour with the formal welcome and the hospitality that you've shown. And I want to say to all of you, obviously we're a new government in Australia. We come with a range of different priorities and objectives, a very different view on climate change to our predecessors, and a very strong focus on the region. We want a strong working relationship, a close working relationship with the Government of New Zealand. And as your Foreign Minister has said, we have such a close friendship between our two nations, and that is part of who we are. It's also essential for the security and well-being of our citizens, even more so in the world in which we stand. We're allies, we're friends, and we're partners in the region and the world that, as the Minister said, is experiencing a much sharper set of challenges. I particularly wanted to emphasise that we see New Zealand as family, and we see our partnership as indispensable. We know we can always rely on each other. One of the areas I am most grateful that we did engage on was having an Indigenous perspective on foreign policy, and the Foreign Minister brings such a depth of personal wisdom to that. One of the differences between the past and the new Australian government is we're committed to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I want, as Foreign Minister, that to be part of how we talk about ourselves to the world and how we engage with the world, as well as what we do domestically. We discussed many matters. One of them was, of course, the importance of the Pacific Island Forum, the unique role of the forum, and the security architecture associated with the forum. we both welcome the unity of the forum being reinforced and the sustained efforts of all Pacific leaders, of so many Pacific leaders in support of the forum. As we go forward, I'm really confident and optimistic about the ways in which Foreign Minister Mahuta and I can work together. I really appreciated her insights as someone who's been in the jobs longer than I and has a much greater insight into the Pacific. I really have appreciated her insights in our very constructive and pretty long and very friendly discussion. So thank you very much, Foreign Minister, for inviting me here. And thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with you. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Well, we'll take some questions.
Could you discuss today China's recent moves in the Pacific and what can New Zealand and Australia do about it?
We can work together, and we do and will.
And we have both recognised that the Pacific is a contested space. And so by working together, it will be important to ensure that we work alongside the Pacific as they define their priorities, but also the way in which we partner the Pacific on their biggest issues like climate change, like economic resilience, are areas where we've identified there are opportunities for us to work together.
Minister Mahuta, you've been criticised for not actually, having any recent visits to, for example, the Solomons and Samoa. Do you have any plans for those visits, and how do you take that criticism?
Oh, look, I think our relationship across the Pacific is very strong. And when I came into the role, certainly started to ensure that we had a range of engagements with the Pacific. As borders open, I've indicated that I will go to the Pacific, and certainly with the PIF coming up very soon, that is an area where I want to ensure that we can address some of the regional issues. So I'm keen to be travelling to the Pacific.
You like travelling?
Yeah, I do actually. The difficulty for me when I came into office, as you know, borders weren't open. So we had a two years of a COVID response, and it was really practically challenging.
Minister Wong, since taking the job, you've been heavy in your language use of calling Australia a part of the Pacific family. Can I ask firstly, what is your assessment of whether Pacific nations consider Australia a member of that family, perhaps an estranged member? And secondly, do you think we are on the cusp of a remaking of the Pacific security architecture, updating Vikatawa at the next Pacific Island Forum?
Well, first, I think Australia has more to do as a member of the Pacific family. And I don't think anybody watching, I don't want to get into too much domestic politics, but I don't think anybody watching what has occurred in terms of various Pacific Island Forum engagements and bilateral engagements would doubt that many countries in the region have been concerned about Australia's previous position on climate. And I know that from when I was Climate Minister. So I was Climate Minister between 2007 and 2010. It's was expressed to me then, as is articulated, including in the Boy Declaration, that climate change was the #1 national security and economic challenge facing the region. So part of why I wanted to engage really early was because I think we do have some ground to make up. And we want to demonstrate we bring a commitment, a stronger and more ambitious commitments on climate, because we actually think it matters, and more resources and more energy on that. In terms of your question about what the forum will deal with, obviously that will be a matter for foreign ministers and leaders. It will be a matter for the region.
We've got a question down the front.
Tēnā Minister Wong. Our government has worked really hard with our engagement with tangata whenua, with Māori here. What can you take back to your government in terms of engagement, co-governance perhaps with your iwi, with your Indigenous people?
Indigenous people, that's a word I've learnt today. We can learn a lot from your country, and I'm reluctant to speak outside of my policy area, and some of the things you reference are really issues that are within domestic portfolios, but I would just talk in general terms. I think we can learn a lot about the way you have learned to work together and some of the difficult things you have addressed. I think the respect, both in some of your legal frameworks, but also in terms of how you talk about who you are for Māori, is different, and it's a journey we're on. And I always used to say during the election that there are many reasons why I wanted to win government for the country, and I wouldn't mind doing this job either, obviously, but for the country. But first among them was the hope that we could be part of a government that could work with our First Nations people to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart, with all of its power and graciousness.
Senator Wong, what do you expect NATO's role in this region is going to achieve, and particularly what role will Australia, New Zealand, South Korea and Japan play in connection with NATO, and how will NATO's role differ or supplement that of the Quad?
Well, we didn't actually have much discussion about NATO per se, but we did talk a lot more about what we could do in terms of our coordination on the development assistance, climate policy as between our two nations, and certainly could we coordinate better with other development partners. And so, we certainly want to work on that. I think the whole is often greater than the sum of the parts, and I think there's certainly a willingness for us to work together more closely on some of those matters.
Sam Fati in the front.
Senator Wong, following up on what you said about the need for coordination, Australia is in a growing number of groupings, alliances that New Zealand is not, the Quad, AUKUS. What complications does that pose insofar as you may have access to information and arrangements that you possibly can't share as readily with New Zealand as you might like? And how do you resolve that? Would it be helpful for New Zealand to seek, associate status if they have roles in any of these?
Those are. I'm not here to determine the foreign policy of New Zealand. I'm sure you're quite capable of doing that. I don't see you setting it up as a sort of a binary. I don't agree with that. I mean, I think we went to the Quad meeting, obviously, as one of our first meetings. A few hours after we were sworn in. That's a very important group, particularly at a time of strategic competition. But it works alongside other parts of the regional architecture or other aspects of regional architecture, whether it's ASEAN or the EAS. These are discussions between like-minded partners that work alongside regional architecture, including obviously the Pacific Island Forum, which is of central importance to our two nations. I think we live in a time where we know that there is a lot more contest, I think more competition in the world in which we live. We should be focused on working with others about what we're for. And what we're for is peace, prosperity, stability, and the rules of the road being predictable and applicable to all nations, regardless of their size.
Minister, we often receive quite graphic, Minister Wong, often graphic images and footage coming out of detention centres in Australia. Will your government be the one to bring an end to the alleged ill treatment of deportees or detainees and the wider issue of 501 deportees?
Well, I think the 501 issue has been discussed between our Prime Ministers and I think Prime Minister Albanese has made some statements about that. We understand the concerns that have been raised and we'll take those into consideration.
Minister, tētai pātai ki a koe, he haere tahi o ngā kōrero ngā rautaki rānei kua whakatakotoria e koe kōrero tahi ki tēnei minita, e pāna ki te tino rangatiratanga o ngā iwi take.
He tauira kei Wainganui a mātou, kia āta te tiro ki tētihi whāinga nunui, me he mea ka puia te whakaaro kei roto i Ahitereiria me te minita nei ki te tiakinga manoko o ngā tangata whenua o Aotearoa, te tiro mai, kei a mātou e te hi o ngā tauira. We'll just come to the front here and then I'll move along.
Minister Wong, you've spoken about developing an Indigenous foreign policy. What are some things, I guess, you've learned from Minister Mahuta and New Zealand, and how did you find the Port Whitty this morning and singing the Waiata?
I was really moved, actually. Too much of a softie sometimes, clearly. No, it was really moving. It's an act of respect and honour, isn't it? And you feel the power of that. And being welcome to someone's land is, you feel the import of that. What was the first part of your question? First Nations foreign policy, Indigenous foreign policy. Well, look, I think I sort of referenced that in answer to one of your colleagues earlier. I mean, I've explained why we want to. I think it's about who we are. We are a modern, multicultural, diverse nation, and we have the privilege of one of the oldest continuing cultures on earth, and we should integrate that much more into how we engage with the world and how we talk to and with the world and about ourselves. I think I read a couple of speeches from Foreign Minister Mahuta as preparation for this, where she talked about concepts, Māori concepts that were important to her foreign policy and to your foreign policy. I thought they were extraordinarily powerful. They're not speeches I could give yet around what it is from First Nations heritage that we would want to include. So I suppose one of the things I learned is that is one of the ways in which you can do it, at least to talk about who you are and how that is expressed through your foreign policy, drawing on your heritage in a different way.
We'll just come next.
Minister Wong, how valuable has the face-to-face engagement you've had through your travels in the Pacific been, and what do you hope to achieve visiting the Solomons tomorrow, I believe?
Well, I said early on that I wanted to bring new energy and new resources to the Pacific. As I said in answer to one of your colleagues, I think we've got a bit of ground to make up. We recognise that, and it was important for me to get out and listen to people's perspectives and learn from that, but also to talk with them about our renewed ambition on climate, our much more ambitious commitments, and our commitments on labour mobility and Pacific engagement visa and additional development assistance, all of which were part of our election commitments.
Just time for a few more questions. Sure. On the Pacific, there appears to have been a de facto division in the past where New Zealand has focused primarily on Polynesian nations, I think Australia on Melanesia and the United States on Micronesia. Is that approach still fit for purpose? Do you think both countries, this is to either minister, both countries perhaps need to sort of expand and not sort of segment the work as much as has been the case?
Yeah, look, in our conversations, we've identified that we need to broaden our collective approach in terms of the relationship across the whole of the Pacific. And we are both agreed that things have changed. As I said earlier, the Pacific is a contested space. We need to work together through regional institutions to support the Pacific and their aspirations. That will require, by and large, a aligned effort, but it also rely on our ability to broaden our relationship. And we've both identified that that is needed now. Things have changed. We're in a new conversation space around where the Pacific priorities must be led from. And it's certainly our view that the Pacific are key to articulating what that looks like. I'll just come to someone who hasn't had a question and then I'll come back. Thank you.
Hi, you guys talk a lot about partnership. What does that look like in practical measures? Are we going to see more projects, infrastructure projects together, climate financing together, or is it more just a kind of discussion across the two countries?
Oh no, it's action. As I said earlier, when Minister Wong came into her role, some early signals were very much welcomed from New Zealand in relation to climate change. But let's be really clear, our response to climate change must be a global one, and what we do together in the region alongside other partners who are committing to climate change impacts that can benefit the Pacific will be a natural area where we can work in partnership, again, alongside the Pacific. I'll come over here.
To Minister Wong, is Australia fully committed to ongoing funding for the Nauru Regional Processing Centre, given its importance to Nauru and its budget, and sort of expanding out? Is it a goal of Australia and New Zealand foreign policy to work together to support Pacific economies to avoid an over-reliance or an indebtedness on China?
So you ask questions with lots of bits to them. Well, look, in terms of Operation Sovereign Borders, we've been clear, including offshore processing, we've been clear about the government's maintenance of that. Your question about indebtedness, though, is a very important one. And the sustainability and of debt financing for developing countries, particularly those in our region, is of interest to both our nations. It goes to sovereignty and choice, and it goes to stability. It also potentially goes to security of the region. So, I think we both our nations, both our countries, are seized, as are other members of the Pacific Island Forum, about the importance of debt arrangements which are reasonable and fair and which avoid countries being unduly burdened, not just in the now, but in the decades to come.
And last question, and then that's it.
This one's for both ministers. What do you both make of China's move to extend its military operations in the Taiwan Strait?
We've experienced a real challenge in terms of China's influence across the Indo-Pacific region. Can I just say that in the latest readout of my meeting with Foreign Minister Wong Yi, I reflected our views in that area, that we want greater stability and peace to be the priority, and that will be very important, and we'll commit ourselves to ensuring that that remains the message and the focus in the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, and our long-standing position is very clear. We support the status quo, and we would urge there be no unilateral changes which would disrupt the status quo in relation to the status of Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Kia ora.